A man named Howard Kirby sat in his garage on a Saturday morning in rural Michigan, staring at an old sofa that had been in his family for as long as he could remember. The piece was worn, the fabric faded to a dull brown that might have once been burgundy. Springs pushed through the cushions in places, and the wooden legs wobbled when you sat down too quickly. His wife had been asking him to get rid of it for months, maybe even a year. It took up space they needed for storage, and honestly it was an eyesore. But Howard had kept putting it off, not out of sentimentality exactly, more like inertia. The sofa had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, and now it sat in his garage collecting dust and old cardboard boxes. That morning, Howard finally decided to do something about it. He wasn't planning anything elaborate. Maybe he would strip it down for parts, see if the frame was worth keeping for a DIY project he had been thinking about, or maybe he would just haul the whole thing to the dump. Either way, it was time. He pulled on work gloves, grabbed a utility knife from his toolbox, and got started. The fabric came away easier than he expected. Decades of use had weakened the stitching, and the staples holding everything together were rusted and brittle. As he peeled back the outer layer, he found yellowed batting and horsehair stuffing, the kind they used in furniture before foam became standard. Dust filled the air, and he had to step back a few times to catch his breath. He was about halfway through removing the bottom panel when his knife caught on something that didn't feel like fabric or wood. It was paper, thick, bundled paper. Howard stopped. He set down the knife and used his hands to pull away more of the covering. What he found underneath made him freeze. Stacks of cash, actual cash, old bills wrapped in rubber bands that had long since disintegrated into brittle pieces. The money was tucked deep into the frame, wedged between support beams and hidden beneath layers of fabric that no one would have thought to look under unless they were taking the entire piece apart. He pulled out one stack, then another, then another. They kept coming. $20 bills, $50 bills, even a few hundreds. Some of them were so old they didn't look like modern currency. The paper was different, the design slightly off from what you would see in a wallet today. Howard's hands were shaking. He sat down on the garage floor, surrounded by piles of money, trying to process what he was looking at. Howard Kirby had not been in a good place financially. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at a local manufacturing plant, a job that paid the bills but didn't leave much room for anything extra. His wife, Linda, worked part-time at a grocery store to help cover expenses. They had 2 kids in high school, and the cost of everything, from gas to groceries to insurance, seemed to climb every year. They weren't drowning, but they were treading water. There was no savings account to speak of, no emergency fund. When the car needed new brakes a few months earlier, they had put it on a credit card and were still paying it off in installments. The sofa had been in the family for decades, passed down from Howard's grandfather to his father, and then to him when his father passed away about 8 years earlier. It had sat in his father's living room for as long as Howard could remember, a piece of furniture that nobody really liked but nobody got rid of either. When Howard's father died, he and his siblings divided up the estate. There wasn't much. The house was sold to cover medical bills and funeral costs. Howard took a few items, mostly out of obligation. The sofa was one of them. He didn't have space for it in his house, so it went straight into the garage. Linda asked him more than once why he kept it. He didn't have a good answer. Now, sitting on the floor of that garage, surrounded by cash that had been hidden inside the sofa for who knows how long, Howard realized he had been holding on to something far more valuable than he ever imagined. But he also realized he had no idea what to do next. The money was real. He could tell that much just by looking at it. But how much was there? Where did it come from? And more importantly, was it legal for him to keep it? Howard spent the rest of that morning carefully removing every last bill from the sofa. He worked slowly, methodically, checking every seam and crevice to make sure he didn't miss anything. By the time he finished, he had stacks of cash covering his workbench. He didn't count it right away. He just stared at it, trying to wrap his head around what had happened. When Linda came out to the garage to ask if he wanted lunch, she stopped in the doorway. Her eyes went wide. She asked what he was doing, and he told her. She didn't believe him at first. She thought maybe he was joking or that he had found some kind of prop money, but when she picked up one of the bills and held it up to the light, she realized it was real. They closed the garage door. They didn't want the neighbors seeing anything. Then they sat down together and started counting. It took hours. They counted and recounted, separating the bills by denomination, making sure they didn't lose track of where they were. Some of the bills were in near-perfect condition, crisp and clean despite being hidden away for decades. Others were worn, creased and faded. A few had handwritten notes on them, old phone numbers or names that meant nothing to Howard or Linda. By the time they finished, they had counted just over $73,000. $73,000, hidden in a sofa, for decades. Howard sat back in his chair, staring at the money spread out across the workbench. His first thought was disbelief. His second thought was fear. What if this money was stolen? What if it belonged to someone else? What if there were legal consequences for keeping it? Linda had the same concerns. She suggested they call a lawyer. Howard agreed. But before they did that, they wanted to understand more about where the money might have come from. Howard's grandfather had been a modest man. He worked as a mechanic for most of his life, running a small repair shop in the same town where Howard grew up. He wasn't wealthy, but he was careful with money. He lived through the Great Depression, and that experience shaped the way he thought about finances. He didn't trust banks. Howard remembered his father saying that more than once. His grandfather kept cash at home, paid for things in cash and avoided credit whenever possible. It wasn't unusual for people of that generation to distrust financial institutions, especially if they had lived through bank failures and economic collapse. Howard's father had been similar, though not quite as extreme. He used banks, but he also kept cash around the house, tucked away in drawers and closets. Nothing like $73,000, but enough that it wouldn't have been surprising if his grandfather had done the same thing on a larger scale. The more Howard thought about it, the more it made sense. His grandfather had probably hidden the money in the sofa sometime in the 1950s or 60s, maybe even earlier. He might have been adding to it over the years, stashing away cash whenever he had extra. And then he either forgot about it, or he died before he had a chance to tell anyone where it was. But that was just a theory. Howard didn't have any proof. He didn't have documents or receipts or anything that would confirm where the money came from. All he had was a pile of cash and a lot of questions. The next step was verification. Howard needed to know if the money was legitimate, if it could be spent, and if there were any legal issues he needed to worry about. He contacted a lawyer, someone he knew through a friend at work. The lawyer listened to the story, asked a few questions, and then gave Howard some advice that was both reassuring and complicated. First, the good news. If the money had been hidden in the sofa by Howard's grandfather, and if the sofa had been legally passed down to Howard through inheritance, then the money was likely his to keep. There was no evidence of theft or illegal activity, and since the sofa had been in the family for decades, it was reasonable to assume that the money had been placed there by a family member. However, there were potential complications. If anyone else had a claim to the estate, they could argue that the money should have been disclosed and divided among the heirs. Howard's siblings might have a case if they decided to pursue it, though the lawyer pointed out that most people wouldn't bother going through the legal hassle unless the amount was significantly larger. There was also the issue of taxes. The IRS considers found money to be taxable income in the year it is discovered. That meant Howard would need to report the $73,000 on his tax return and pay income tax on it. Depending on his tax bracket, that could mean owing anywhere from 15 to 25% of the total amount. Howard felt the weight of that reality. Even if he got to keep the money, a significant chunk of it would go to the government. But even after taxes, he would still be left with somewhere between $50,000 and $60,000. That was life-changing money for someone in his situation. The lawyer also advised Howard to have the bills examined by a currency expert. Some of the older bills might be worth more than face value to collectors. If any of them were rare or in exceptional condition, Howard could potentially sell them for a premium. Howard took that advice. He contacted a numismatist, a professional who specializes in currency and rare bills. The expert agreed to meet with him and examine the collection. The appointment took place at the expert's office, a small shop in a nearby city that dealt in coins, currency, and collectibles. Howard brought the money in a locked briefcase, feeling more nervous than he had in years. He half expected someone to stop him on the street and demand to know what he was carrying. The numismatist, a man in his 60s named Gerald, examined the bills carefully. He used a magnifying glass, checked serial numbers, and compared the notes to reference guides. Most of the bills, he explained, were common. They were old, yes, but not rare enough to be worth more than face value. However, there were a few exceptions. One of the $50 bills was from a series that had a limited print run in the 1930s. It was in excellent condition, and Gerald estimated it could sell for around $800 to the right collector. There were also a handful of $20 bills from the 1920s that were worth slightly more than face value, maybe $50 to $100 each. In total, Gerald estimated that Howard could get an additional $2,000 to $3,000 if he sold the collectible bills instead of spending them. It wasn't a huge difference, but it was something. Howard decided to sell the collectible bills. Gerald offered to handle the sale through his network of collectors, and Howard agreed. The rest of the money, the bills that were worth only face value, he kept. He deposited most of it into a newly opened savings account, keeping a small amount in cash for immediate expenses. Now came the question of what to do with the money. Howard and Linda sat down and made a list. They started with the most pressing needs. The credit card debt from the car repair. That was about $1,200 gone, paid off immediately. Then there were other smaller debts, little things that had been adding up over the years. A medical bill from when their son broke his arm playing basketball. Another credit card they had been carrying a balance on for months. All of it cleared. After the debts were paid, they had a conversation about priorities. Their house needed work. The roof was aging, and they had been putting off replacing it because they couldn't afford it. The HVAC system was on its last legs. The kitchen appliances were older than their kids. They could use the money to make their home more comfortable and increase its value at the same time. But there were other considerations too. Their daughter was a junior in high school, and college was only a year away. They had always assumed she would need to take out student loans, just like they had. But now, with this money, they could help her. Maybe not pay for everything, but cover a significant portion of her tuition and expenses. That would set her up for a better start in life than they had. And then there was retirement. Howard was in his mid-40s. He had a small retirement account through work, but it wasn't much. If they put some of this money into a retirement fund and let it grow over the next 20 years, it could make a real difference when the time came to stop working. They decided to split the money 3 ways. 1/3 went into home repairs. They hired a contractor to replace the roof and upgrade the HVAC system. The work took a few months, but when it was done, the house felt like a different place. Warmer in the winter, cooler in the summer, and no more worrying about leaks every time it rained. 1/3 went into a college fund for their daughter. They opened a 529 plan and deposited the money there. It wouldn't cover 4 years at a private university, but it would make a significant dent in the cost of a state school, and it would keep her from graduating with a mountain of debt. The final 1/3 went into savings and retirement. They kept some of it liquid in case of emergencies, and invested the rest in a mix of conservative mutual funds. It wasn't glamorous, but it was smart. It was the kind of financial cushion they had never had before. The most immediate change was psychological. For the first time in years, Howard and Linda didn't feel like they were one bad month away from financial disaster. They had breathing room. They could handle an unexpected car repair or a medical bill without going into debt. That feeling of security was worth more than any dollar amount. But the discovery also raised questions that didn't have easy answers. Howard couldn't stop thinking about his grandfather. Why had he hidden the money? Was it just a product of his distrust of banks, or was there something more to it? Had he intended to use it for something specific, or was he simply saving it for a rainy day that never came? Howard wished he could ask him, but his grandfather had been gone for over 40 years, and his father had never mentioned the money. Either he didn't know about it, or he had forgotten, or maybe he had looked for it at some point and never found it. There was also the question of Howard's siblings. The lawyer had said they might have a claim to the money if they wanted to pursue it. Howard thought about telling them, but he decided against it. The sofa had been passed to him. He had been the one to take it, to store it, to eventually take it apart. If the money had been in any of the other items his siblings had taken, they would have found it. The fact that it had been in the sofa felt like luck, but it also felt like it was meant to be his. Linda agreed. She pointed out that his siblings had never helped with any of the costs associated with their father's estate. They hadn't contributed to the funeral expenses, and they hadn't offered to help when Howard was struggling financially. This money, she argued, was a windfall that had come to them because Howard had held on to something no one else wanted. It didn't feel right to share it. Howard knew she was right, but he still felt a pang of guilt. He wondered what his father would have wanted. He wondered if his grandfather would have approved of how the money was being used, but in the end, he decided that the best way to honor their memory was to use the money wisely, to take care of his family, and to make sure his kids had opportunities he never had. The story didn't end there, though. Word got out. Not because Howard or Linda said anything, but because small towns are small towns and people talk. Someone at the bank must have mentioned something, or maybe the contractor said something to a neighbor. Within a few weeks, people in town knew that Howard had found a significant amount of cash in an old sofa. Most people were happy for him. They congratulated him, said he deserved a break, and asked how he was going to spend it. But there were others who were less enthusiastic. A distant cousin Howard barely knew called and suggested that the money should be divided among all of the grandchildren, not just Howard. A few people in town made snide comments, implying that Howard must have known the money was there all along and had been hiding it. Howard tried to ignore the negativity, but it bothered him. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had found money that had been hidden by his own grandfather in a piece of furniture that had been legally passed down to him. But people love to speculate, and some people can't handle seeing others get ahead. The attention died down after a while. Life returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. Howard went back to work. Linda kept her job at the grocery store, though they talked about whether she might want to cut back her hours now that they had more financial stability. The kids finished the school year and moved on to the next one, largely unaware of how much their lives had been changed by what their father found in the garage. But Howard never forgot. He kept a single $20 bill from the stash, one of the older ones that wasn't worth much to collectors, but had been part of the original find. He framed it and hung it in his home office, a reminder of the day everything changed. He thought about that day often, the way he had almost thrown the sofa away without a second thought, the way he had been so close to missing the discovery entirely. If he had taken the sofa to the dump instead of trying to salvage the frame, the money would have been lost forever. If he had waited another month, another year, someone else might have convinced him to just get rid of it. Timing, he realized, mattered more than people gave it credit for. Now, before we go any further, if you're finding this story as incredible as I did when I first came across it, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. These kinds of discoveries happen more often than you might think, and every single one of them is fascinating. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for what's coming next. The tax bill came a few months later, just as the lawyer had predicted. Howard owed just over $18,000 in federal and state taxes on the found money. It hurt to write that check, but he had been prepared for it. He paid it in full, no payment plan needed, and that was that. After taxes, after the debts, after the home repairs and the college fund and the savings, Howard and Linda were left with a financial foundation they had never dreamed of having. But the impact went beyond the numbers. The discovery changed the way Howard thought about value and opportunity. He started paying more attention to things other people overlooked. He became more willing to take on projects, to dig a little deeper, to see potential where others saw junk. He bought a few items at estate sales and garage sales, not expecting to find hidden treasure, but curious about what might be underneath the surface. He never found another stash of cash, but he did find other things of value. An old painting that turned out to be worth a few $100s. A set of tools that he was able to resell for a profit. Nothing life-changing, but enough to remind him that the world is full of hidden value if you know where to look. Linda had her own takeaway from the experience. She started thinking more about her own family's history, the things that had been passed down to her over the years. She went through old boxes in the attic, looking for anything that might have been overlooked. She didn't find money, but she did find letters, photographs, and documents that gave her a deeper understanding of where she came from. That, she decided, was its own kind of treasure. Their daughter went to college a year later, and the money they had set aside made a real difference. She was able to focus on her studies without working multiple part-time jobs to make ends meet. She graduated with a degree in engineering and a fraction of the debt her parents had carried. When she got her first job, she called her father and thanked him. She said she knew how hard things had been, and she appreciated everything he had done for her. Howard didn't tell her the full story of where the money came from. Not yet. He figured he would tell her someday when the time was right. For now, it was enough to know that something his grandfather had hidden away decades ago had ended up giving his daughter a better future. That felt like the right way for the story to end. But even as life moved forward, Howard couldn't shake the sense of wonder he felt every time he thought about that morning in the garage. The randomness of it, the timing, the fact that he had held onto that sofa for years without knowing what was inside. If you had asked him the day before he found the money what the sofa was worth, he would have said maybe $20 at a yard sale if he was lucky. Now, it had turned into the most valuable piece of furniture he had ever owned. He thought about all the other objects out there, sitting in garages and attics and basements, holding secrets no one knows about. How many other people had thrown away something valuable without realizing it? How many fortunes had been lost because someone didn't take the time to look? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the real lesson wasn't about the money. It was about attention, about taking the time to examine things closely, to question assumptions, to not take anything at face value. His grandfather had hidden that money for a reason, and it had stayed hidden because no one thought to look for it. If Howard had trusted his first instinct and thrown the sofa away, the money would still be hidden, probably buried in a landfill somewhere, lost forever. Instead, he had taken the time to look closer, and that made all the difference. Years later, when people asked Howard about the experience, he always said the same thing. He said he got lucky, and he did. But luck, he realized, isn't just about chance. It's about being in the right place at the right time and paying attention when something doesn't seem quite right. It's about asking questions, being curious, and not dismissing things just because they seem old or worn out or worthless. That sofa had been in his family for decades. It had been sat on, slept on, moved from house to house, and eventually relegated to a dusty corner of a garage. No one had given it a second thought. No one had suspected it held anything of value. And yet, hidden beneath layers of fabric and stuffing, there had been enough money to change a family's financial trajectory. Howard often wondered what his grandfather would think if he knew what had happened. Would he be surprised, pleased, disappointed that the money had stayed hidden for so long? Howard liked to think his grandfather would be happy. He had worked hard for that money, saved it carefully, and hidden it away for a reason. Maybe he had always intended for it to be found by someone in the family who needed it. Maybe that was the plan all along. Or maybe it was just a man being cautious, keeping his savings close, not trusting banks or institutions to protect what he had earned. Either way, the money had done what money is supposed to do. It had provided security. It had created opportunities. It had given a family a chance to breathe, to plan, to hope for something better. The numismatist, Gerald, had told Howard something during their meeting that stuck with him. He said that old currency is interesting, not just because of its monetary value, but because of the stories attached to it. Every bill passes through countless hands over its lifetime. It gets earned, spent, saved, lost, and found. It changes lives in small ways and sometimes in big ways. The bills Howard found in that sofa had been part of someone's life decades ago, and now they were part of his life, and someday they would be part of someone else's life. That continuity, that sense of connection across time, was something Howard found deeply meaningful. The money his grandfather had hidden away hadn't just been sitting there doing nothing. It had been waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right need. And when that moment came, it had been there, ready to make a difference. Howard's son, who had been in high school when the money was found, went on to study business in college. He became interested in finance and investing, partly because of what had happened with the sofa. He asked his father about it once, how it felt to suddenly have that kind of money. Howard told him the truth. He said it was overwhelming at first. Then exciting, then sobering when he realized how much of it would go to taxes and debts. But in the end, it had been a blessing. Not because of the money itself, but because of what it allowed them to do. It gave them choices they hadn't had before. And choice, Howard said, is the real measure of wealth. His son took that lesson to heart. He became careful with money, deliberate in his decisions, always thinking about the future. He saved aggressively, invested wisely, and avoided the kind of debt his parents had struggled with for so many years. When people asked him where he learned to manage money so well, he told them about the sofa, about the discovery that had changed his family's life and taught him the value of patience, attention, and careful planning. Linda, for her part, became more philosophical about the whole thing. She said it reminded her that life is full of surprises, and not all of them are bad. She had spent so many years worrying about money, about making ends meet, about what would happen if something went wrong. And then, out of nowhere, something had gone right. It didn't erase the years of struggle, but it did prove that things could change. That sometimes when you least expect it, life hands you an opportunity. She also became an advocate for looking at things differently. She told her friends to hold on to family heirlooms, even if they seemed worthless. She encouraged people to dig through old belongings before throwing them away. She said you never know what you might find, and even if you don't find money, you might find something else of value. A letter, a photograph, a memory. As the years went by, the story of the sofa became part of the family's mythology. It was the story they told at gatherings, the one that always got a reaction. New people who married into the family heard it and couldn't believe it. Grandchildren who came along years later grew up knowing about the sofa and the hidden money, and it shaped the way they thought about the past and the objects that connect generations. Howard kept the frame of the sofa for a while, even after he had removed all the money. He thought about rebuilding it, reupholstering it, making it into something functional again, but in the end he decided not to. The frame had done its job. It had held the money safely for decades, and now it had given up its secret. Rebuilding it felt like trying to recapture something that was already complete. So he dismantled the frame, saved a few pieces as keepsakes, and let the rest go. The $20 bill he had framed, the one hanging in his office, became a conversation starter. People asked about it, and Howard told them the story. Some people didn't believe him at first. They thought he was exaggerating or making it up. But he had the receipts, the tax documents, the proof. It had really happened. He had really found $73,000 in an old sofa, and it had really changed his life. Looking back, Howard realized that the discovery had come at exactly the right time, a few years earlier, and he might not have been ready to handle it responsibly. He might have spent it all on things that didn't matter, chasing short-term gratification instead of long-term stability. A few years later, and his financial situation might have been even more dire, the debts even larger, the stress even more overwhelming. But it had happened when it happened, and that timing had allowed him to make the most of it. He also realized that the discovery had been possible only because he had held onto the sofa in the first place. If he had listened to Linda and gotten rid of it years earlier, the money would have been lost. If he had sold it at a garage sale or donated it to a thrift store, someone else would have found it. The fact that he had kept it, even when it seemed like a burden, had turned out to be the best decision he ever made, even though he hadn't known it at the time. That taught him something about patience and persistence, about not giving up on things too quickly, even when they seem like dead weight. Sometimes the things we carry with us, the burdens we shoulder, turn out to have value we can't see until we take the time to really look. Howard's experience also made him think about all the other people out there who might be sitting on hidden wealth without knowing it. How many old pieces of furniture are out there, stuffed with cash or valuables that were hidden away and forgotten? How many attics and basements hold treasures that could change someone's life if they were discovered? He started reading about other cases, other discoveries. There were stories of people finding money in walls during renovations, gold coins hidden in the floorboards of old houses, jewelry tucked away in the linings of suitcases. Each story was different, but they all had the same theme. Someone had hidden something valuable, intending to retrieve it later. And then circumstances changed. They died. They forgot. They moved away. And the treasure stayed hidden, sometimes for decades, sometimes for generations, until someone stumbled across it by accident. Howard realized he was part of a long tradition of accidental treasure hunters. People who weren't looking for anything in particular, but found something extraordinary because they were willing to take the time to look. It was a reminder that the world is full of mysteries, and some of them are hidden in the most ordinary places. The sofa itself had been so unremarkable: brown fabric, sagging cushions, wobbly legs. Nothing about it screamed valuable or important. It was just an old piece of furniture that had been passed down through the family because no one wanted to throw it away. And yet, inside that ordinary object, there had been extraordinary value, not because of what the sofa was, but because of what it contained. That distinction mattered. It reminded Howard that value isn't always visible on the surface. Sometimes you have to dig deeper. You have to be willing to take things apart, to look inside, to question what you think you know. Most of the time, you won't find anything. Most old sofas are just old sofas. But sometimes, if you're patient and thorough and a little bit lucky, you find something that changes everything. And that possibility, that chance, is worth holding on to. As we wrap up this story, I want to leave you with something to think about. How many things in your life do you overlook because they seem ordinary? How many objects do you have sitting around that you've never really examined? What would happen if you took the time to look a little closer? You might not find $73,000 in an old sofa, but you might find something else, a memory, a connection, a piece of history. And sometimes, that's just as valuable. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories about hidden treasures and unexpected discoveries. There's always another fortune waiting to be found, and you never know where the next one might be hiding. Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes the most valuable things are the ones we almost throw away.